I was busy in the kitchen setting the table with our finest dinner attire and lighting candles that flickered softly against the cream walls of our dining room on a quiet Saturday evening, the kind I usually loved. The house smelled of freshly baked lasagna, a recipe I'd perfected over the years. Cooking had always been my way of showing love, something warm, something familiar. Tom, my husband, sat in the living room scrolling on his phone. As always, he barely looked up when I called out dinner's almost ready. I'd grown used to his distractions over the years. It wasn't that he didn't care, at least I didn't think so, but his attention had a way of drifting, especially when his best friend Mark was coming over. Mark's visits had become a routine too. Routine perhaps he'd arve with his easy charm, his booming laugh and a bottle of wine, as if he were part of the family, and tonight was no different when the doorbell rang. I called to Tom to answer it, but he didn't budge. Typical. I wiped my hands on my apron and opened the door. There was Mark, grinning ear to ear, holding a bottle of expensive Miro for my favorite hostess, he said, stepping inside and pulling me into one of his hugs. Only this time it lingered just a bit too long. I laughed it off, patting his back on awkwardly as I pulled away. "You're spoiling us, Mark," I said, leading him into the dining room, but inside I felt a flicker of something, an unease I couldn't quite place. Although I always took pride in making our house welcoming, something about the atmosphere felt heavier tonight. Perhaps it was Mark's hug, or the long week catching up with me, but the feeling persisted like a shadow I couldn't shake. The dining room looked cozy and welcoming, with the candles casting a soft glow over the table. Dinner began as usual with light conversation and laughter. Mark had a way of energizing the room with his jokes, making even Tom laugh despite his usual obsession with his phone. However, tonight's jokes had a sharper edge and were aimed at me. More often than not, "You're too good for him." Sarah. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach, but I told myself it was nothing because I was overanalyzing it. Mark winked as I passed the brie basket, and Tom laughed as if it were just harmless banter. But then Mark's hand touched mine when he reached for the salt, lingering just a second too long. I froze for a moment, staring at him, but he didn't seem fazed. He met my eyes, holding them for a little too long before flashing that famous smile. Unaware as usual, Tom was occupied with narrating a story from work, gesturing with his fork in an expressive manner. Tom excused himself to take a call in the other room, leaving me alone with Mark. I tried to concentrate on gathering the dishes, but I could feel his gaze on me, sharp and lingering. "You really do too much," he said softly, leaning against the kitchen doorway. Tom doesn't know how lucky he is. The way he said it made my skin crawl. I laughed when I was supposed to smile at the right moments, but I could feel Mark's attention on me. His voice sounded quite different from one of kindness or admiration. I smirked and dismissed him, saying, "You're too nice." "Mark, excuse me, I have to finish up in here." He didn't move right away, and for a moment I thought he was going to say something else that I wasn't ready to hear. Then, with a smirk and a shrug, he turned and walked back to the dining room. I stood there for a moment, gripping the edge of the counter, trying to get rid of the uneasiness. Maybe I was overreacting, I told myself, but that seed of doubt had been sown, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. That evening after dinner, I found myself alone in the kitchen, clearing the plates and tidying up. The house was quiet except for the rhythmic hum of the refrigerator and the occasional clink of dishes as I put them in the sink. The warm glow of the kitchen lights felt strangely dim, almost suffocating. I was deep in concentration when I heard footsteps behind me. It was Mark, who was leaning casually against the counter with his wine glass in hand. His tone was light, but there was something about it that made my skin tingle as I wiped the counter. At first, I thought it was just Mark being his typical, too familiar self, but then I felt his hand brush against my waist slowly and deliberately, catching my breath as his touch lingered before sliding lower. I froze, my heart thumping in my ears as he muttered, almost casually, "You're too beautiful." The words felt like a slap, bringing me back to reality, and I stammering, "What are you doing?" He continued, "Relax, Sarah. It's just a joke. Don't overreact to a joke." Instead of flinching, he grinned with that same arrogant smile I'd seen 1,000 times before. I realized that this wasn't a joke. This was something much darker, something that broke the trust I'd put in him for years. Without saying another word, I staggered out of the kitchen, my hands shaking, my mind spinning with disbelief and fear. And later that night, as I sat alone in the bedroom, I tried to make sense of what had happened. Mark had always been a part of our lives, a part of our family, almost inseparable since college. Tom used to call him his brother from another mother, and I trusted him, as we all did. However, as I sat there, I started to relive moments I'd dismissed earlier, such as when Mark complimented a dress I wore to a party, his eyes lingering a little too long, or the time he joked about how fortunate Tom was to have me. His tone was a little too serious, and even the way he hugged me felt different now. I thought back to that day at the beach when he made a comment about how I looked in my swimsuit. Tom had laughed it off, and so had I, but now those moments didn't feel harmless. Had I been blind, or worse, had I known deep down but chosen to ignore it? The weight of it all weighed heavily on me, suffocating me, and my trust in Mark was replaced by a sickening sense of betrayal, and for the first time I began to question whether my marriage, the foundation of my life, was as solid as I had assumed. Tom was browsing through his phone and drinking coffee like it was any other day as I sat across from him at the breakfast table the following morning, my heart racing as I tried to find the proper words. I knew that what I had to say would shatter that illusion. "We need to talk about Mark," so I began, my voice quivering. "Tom." He eventually looked up, perplexed, and I took a big breath before telling him everything about how Mark had followed me into the kitchen, touched me, and then dismissed it as a joke. I anticipated astonishment, rage, and possibly even disbelief, but I was surprised by his response. Tom reclined in his seat, crossing his arms. "Sarah, are you certain that doesn't sound like Mark? He's my best friend, and he wouldn't do anything like that." His remarks were quite hurtful. "I am aware of what transpired, Tom. I was there when he touched me, and it wasn't harmless. But rather than consoling me, I murmured in a voice that broke. "You must have misinterpreted the circumstances," Tom said, shaking his head. "Mark has always been amiable. Perhaps you're simply thinking too much about it." His remarks were laden with skepticism and contempt. My chest constricted as I attempted to clarify and convince him of the truth, Tom. I can't believe he went overboard, but he didn't back down. My own husband, who I believed would always be there for me, was defending the man who had betrayed my trust. Tears filled my eyes, but I forced myself to keep them from falling. I spent the next few days replaying the conversation in my head, questioning everything. "Sarah, he's like a brother to me, and I don't think he'd ever do anything to hurt you or me. You're being too sensitive." I had overreacted. I misunderstood Mark's behavior, but I knew in my heart that if Tom didn't defend me, I would have to defend myself. When Mark returned, I didn't wait for him to settle in. Instead, I cornered him in the living room as soon as Tom left to get something from the garage. My hands were shaking, but my voice remained steady. I said, "Mark, we need to talk." He raised an eyebrow, seemingly oblivious to what I was saying. "What you did in the kitchen was unacceptable. If you ever try anything like that again, I will tell your wife for the first time." I noticed a crack in his confidence as his smirk faltered and his eyes darted away. "Come on, Sarah," he said in a light but uneasy tone that it was only a misunderstanding. Don't play games with me. Let's not make this too big." I retaliated, and you know what you did? Avoid me, or I'll make sure the truth is known to everybody. Mark attempted to laugh it off, but he knew I wasn't bluffing because of the tension in his shoulders. That night, I began recording every conversation I had with Mark, noting any offensive remarks or lingering glances. I even confided in my best friend Emma, who listened to me without passing judgment and reassured me that I wasn't crazy and that I was acting appropriately. She advised me to avoid them. The breaking point occurred at a dinner party we hosted a few weeks later, where our closest friends were seated around the table, and the air was filled with the hum of conversation and the clinking of glasses. She gaslighted you into believing that this is your fault, but her support gave me strength and served as a reminder that I wasn't alone in this. I couldn't change what had happened, but I could make sure it didn't happen again. I had prepared all day in an attempt to ignore the tension between Mark and Tom, but as the evening went on, that old uneasiness returned. Mark was being loud, charming, and self-assured as usual, but halfway through dinner he said something that broke the laughter. "Tom is fortunate to have a knife like that." For a brief minute, there was a thick, oppressive quiet that made your skin crawl, as Mark said in a voice that was dripping with something I couldn't quite put into words. If I were him, I wouldn't leave Sarah alone in the kitchen. Everybody's gaze were flitting between me. Tom and Mark, the unspoken tension thickening with every passing second. I glanced at Tom, praying he'd say something, do something, and for the first time I saw it, the flicker of realization in his eyes. He looked at me, then back at Mark, and I knew he understood. The evening continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. I barely noticed when one of our friends, Greg, pulled Tom aside later when the guests had left, and the house was quiet again. Tom sat me down. His face was pale, his jaw clenched. "Greg told me something," he said, his voice low. He said, "Mark's done this before, made other women uncomfortable. There were rumors, but I never believed them." I stared at him, my emotions tangled in a mix of anger and relief. And now I asked. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood up, pacing the room. "I need to talk to him." He finally said, "I need to hear it from him the next day." Tom confronted Mark. I wasn't there, but when Tom came home, his face said it all. Mark had admitted it, downplayed it, of course, tried to brush it off as misunderstandings or harmless jokes, but the truth was undeniable. After Mark left our lives, Tom told him he was no longer welcome in our home or in our marriage. This was a minor win, but it didn't undo the harm. Tom was horrified that his best friend, whom he had trusted like a brother, had deceived him and me in the worst way. Tom expressed regret. "Really," he responded, "I should have believed you," and he sincerely apologized. One evening, when we sat together in the dim light of our living room, I was so devoted to him that I failed you, Sarah. His words were sincere, but they didn't make our relationship better overnight. We decided to go to couple therapy, which was a step I wasn't sure I wanted to take at first, but it ended up being essential. Through those sessions, we started to rebuild our relationship piece by piece, and trust started to grow again. It wasn't always easy, and some days it felt impossible, but we persisted. As for me, I learned something valuable from all of this, and I now carry with me every day, trusting my gut and speaking up even when it seems like no one will listen. I am aware that this event has affected me. It has made me stronger in some ways and hardened me in others. I am no longer scared to speak up for myself and demand respect and accountability from anybody who hears my story. I would like to emphasize that your voice counts. Even when it seems impossible or like everything is against you, don't keep quiet, because facing your suffering head-on is ultimately the best way to find healing, no matter how challenging it may be. Your truth matters.